Last year, we published a joint report looking at Scope 3 and the role of insetting in tackling supply chain emissions. We focused on the supply side of insetting and interviewed about 20 project developers. At the same time, at WBCSD, Kate, that you're going to be hearing from in just a few minutes, was leading a very similar vein of work, but focusing on the demand side. So this webinar really brings the two perspectives together. What's happening on the supply side, what's happening on the demand side. And we're also lucky to have some fantastic speakers who are going to be sharing some first-hand experiences on developing and setting projects, financing and setting projects, and you'll be able to ask them your questions as well. So we know that more than half of the world's GDP moderately or highly depends on nature, and we know that we need to accelerate nature-positive investments. But we also know that companies are under increasing pressure to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, but also to strengthen their supply chain and make sure that their operations are really in harmony with the environment and the communities that they depend on. So what are we going to be talking about in this webinar? First, in just a few seconds, I'm going to go through some definitions so that we're aligned on what we're discussing today. I'm going to then introduce our speakers. We're going to go through a few polls, and here I just want to emphasize this is going to be a very interactive webinar. I'm going to be playing basically the role of taking your questions and asking them to the panelists, so there's going to be a lot of interaction possible. We're then going to hear from IPI and WBCSD on the recent reports that they launched, and then we're going to turn to our panel and ask them some questions. So just going to the next slide. What is insetting? So you may have noticed that the title of this webinar didn't actually talk about insetting. It talked about supply value chain interventions, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. But just before we started, I wanted to give you the definition of insetting, which is provided by the IPI. And they define it as insetting projects or interventions along a company's value chain that are designed to generate GHG emission reduction or carbon storage, and at the same time create positive impacts for communities, landscapes, and ecosystems. So there's a few things to note here. We're talking both about emission reductions, but also about removals. And we're talking not just about carbon, but also about people and nature and biodiversity. So this is the IPI's definition. But when we conducted the research with the IPI, we did realize, and this is also why we use a different word, not everyone uses the expression insetting. So in the interviews, we asked different organizations and different developers, what is it that they referred to if not insetting? And we heard different things. We heard value chain interventions, value chain initiatives, direct investment. So there is a wide range of terminology out there about what we're talking about. But just to make it clear, when we speak about supply value chain interventions, we're using that interchangeably with insetting in the context of this webinar. So our lovely speakers today, I'm really happy to be joined by such amazing speakers. So just to introduce them quickly, we have Kate, who is Senior Manager focused on agriculture and food at WBCSD, a global CEO-led organization of more than 200 leading companies and partners working together to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world. We have Andrew, who is Chief Impact Officer at Soil Capital, the agronomy firm that operates Europe's largest running regenerative agricultural transition program. Andrew led the development of this program, so we'll have some great insights from him, which have seen more than 1,000 French, British, and Belgian farmers enroll and achieve close to 200 tons of verified reductions and removals. And the program is really very much focused on enabling food and beverage firms to deliver Scope 3 reductions. We're also joined by Elijah, who is Director of Corporate Climate Solutions at Conservation International, also referred to as CI. And Elijah focuses on finding ways to scale corporate investments in natural climate solutions and identify how corporates can embed nature in their climate strategies. And he's also he leads on CI's approach on insetting, and is also on the board of the API. So we've been working a lot with Elijah. We're also joined by Tzutzuy, who is Global Head of Climate and Nature for Syngenta Group. So we'll get the corporate perspective. And in her role, she supports the company with its climate agenda. She focuses along Scope 3 on carbon markets and on regenerative agriculture. And Syngenta is one of the world's biggest agricultural technology companies, operating more than 100 countries. And the company strives to transform food production through regenerative agriculture. Last but not least, we're joined by Michael, who is the Executive Director of IPI, a business-led membership organization that advocates for climate action at the source of global value chains. So that's for the lovely people that we have today on the panel. And just before I stop talking and you hear directly from them, I wanted to reemphasize this is an interactive webinar. Please, please, please submit your questions. They will be directly asked to the panelists. I'm only going to be asking one question of each one of them, and then I'm going to be picking your questions. So how to do this? How to access the Q&A? So if you can either take your phone and scan this QR code, which will take you there, or you can type slido.com in your browser and then use the code on this slide. And my colleague Pavel is going to be dropping the link and the code in case you miss it. You can also vote for the questions that you'd like me to ask the panelists. So if the question that gets the most votes will be asked first. And again, the link and the code will be dropped in the chat in just a second. Thank you, Pavel. So it'd be lovely to understand who is actually in the virtual room. So we have two quick questions for you today. We're asking you where you're joining us from today, and then I'll just wait a few seconds to get some answers, and then we'll go to the next poll. Europe, not surprising. The time will do that. Some North America, great. Some from Africa. Let's wait a little more. Some Asia. Well, thank you for joining. That's late hours. Anyone else? Let's wait a few more seconds. Okay, so strong presence from Europe, North America, some South America, welcome. Some Asia, some Africa. Great, thank you very much. And now I'm going to go to the next question, which is, we'd love to understand what your level of experience is with insetting. Are you entirely new to it? Do you know a little bit about it? Do you know a lot? Are you an expert practitioner? This will also help us, it will help the panelists in how they address your question. So you know a bit, most of you know a bit, a lot of you know a lot, great. Some of you are entirely new, we'll keep that in mind. A minority of expert practitioner, that is not a surprise. It is a new field. Great. So I would say the majority seems to know a bit about insetting. So keep that in mind as we go through the questions. Fantastic. Great. Just going to move on. Fantastic. I am going to hand over now to Michael, who is going to be giving us a quick overview of the recent report that we published. So this was a report published by Abatable and IPI, focused on the supply side of insetting. And on that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. So as Pauline mentioned, I'll provide a quick overview of the research that we jointly conducted with Abatable. And this is really looking at challenges and opportunities around insetting from the perspective of project developers. Can we advance to the next slide? And yeah, so our research really highlights the huge potential of insetting to support companies in meeting their climate and nature targets. But one of the main conclusions that came from this, at least in the short term, is that the lack of clear and consistent guidance is really hindering both project developers and companies from investing in insetting. And throughout the presentation, our research really sort of focused on 6 key themes or questions that need to be resolved to enable insetting to scale, which I'll touch on in my presentation. Next slide. So the first theme that came up in our research is really around the wide variability and how insetting is defined. So the definitions and understanding of the concept varies widely among stakeholders. As Pauline mentioned, this includes both the terminology that's used, but also the types of activities that stakeholders believe constitute insetting. And also want to highlight that there's currently no globally agreed definitions for insetting. And there's also a lack of clear guidance on best practices, as well as historic reference points for best practices. So this is really leaving many project developers in the dark about how they may engage in insetting as a practice. And then the second theme really relates to clarifying the geographic boundaries of insetting. And this is really a key barrier given the high divergence in opinions among stakeholders. So under current guidance, if you're looking at scope 3 reductions and removals claims, these can be made for activities on farm. While many stakeholders argue that interventions near supply chain, so this could be in supply sheds, surrounding landscapes, should also qualify as insetting. but the lack of traceability to the farm level and the availability of cost-effective and granular data to measure project impacts is really also, is also inhibiting insetting from scaling. So it's really important to recognize the need for flexibility and the development of pragmatic solutions to ensure that these barriers don't hinder investment where it's needed most. And the third question, so there's really differing views on how we define what high integrity looks like in the context of insetting. So this includes a lack of standardized rules for quantifying, claiming, and verifying emissions reductions and removals, the lack of insetting specific standards or verification protocols, as well as whether there's a need for tradable credits or registries to provide oversight around accounting and claims. So this requires a focus on modular and adaptable approaches and defining core principles to balance flexibility with stringency across various insetting environments. Next slide. And the next theme we looked at is really around project costs. So there's varying perspectives when it comes to insetting costs and business models. And the costs of projects really depend on several factors. So this can be whether a project is going for certification, how many stakeholders are involved, and where the location of interventions are actually taking place. And it was highlighted numerous times in the interviews that companies need to be prepared to pay more for insetting due to additional costs that arise from projects, while also recognizing that investing in insetting also brings additional business benefits. So this could include greater supply chain resilience or the protection against future carbon price dynamics. And then we also looked at what is the role of policy and regulation in the context of insetting. So insetting is, it's a voluntary practice and it's largely unregulated. And also just want to highlight that not many interviewees identified policy as a risk, but those that did emphasize the potential implications of insetting, developing policy, looking at it either as an opportunity or a threat. So demand side regulations, which require companies to disclose their scope 3 emissions, can help to accelerate investment in insetting. But it also remains to be seen whether host countries decide to regulate insetting activities and apply similar rules as they do for offsetting. But I think it's very clear through the interviews that policy can really play a key role in facilitating insetting practices. And then the last area we looked at is really how ready corporates are to engage in insetting. And it was highlighted in many of the interviews as well that a lot of companies are shying away from investing in insetting, and this could be due to various reasons. So fear of stakeholder scrutiny, and also a short-term focus on optimizing procurement costs. And a lot of, many interviewees expressed concern that the prevalent return on investment mindset could also risk stretching farmers, and that corporates really need to take a long-term investment, look at return on investment for the long term in the context of insetting, because a lot of the benefits that I mentioned will take place further down the line. And it was also highlighted that adequate finance is necessary, and this includes pre-finance provided to farmers to support this transition to more sustainable practices. And I'll now hand it back to Pauline to take us through the next part of the webinar.
Thank you, Michael. Just before you go, I'd actually like to ask, what was your main takeaway, and maybe, the thing you'd like to share with the audience today? What's one thing they need to take away from this report?
Yeah, I think through the report and more generally, I think the enabling environment for insetting has really grown in the last few years. So an increased focus on, regulation, scrutiny from stakeholders, and the further development of guidance is really positioning insetting as a really important strategy for corporates to meet their climate and nature goals. But as I mentioned, I think, the lack of clear and standardized guidance, as well as, the understanding of costs and benefits associated with insetting, is really inhibiting this practice from scaling. So I think it's really important that all stakeholders, this includes civil society, standard setters, corporates, project developers, that we all come together and provide the necessary guidance and enabling environment so that companies have the necessary assurances and are incentivized to increase investment in insetting. And I think as well is, looking at pre-competitive collaboration. So looking at like sector or regional level insetting approaches are also really valuable to unlock large economies of scale for insetting.
Thank you, Michael. On that, Kate, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Pauline. So I'll just spend a few minutes sharing some of the key themes from a recent publication from WBCSD, which is our Scope 3 action agenda. Hopefully this will complement some of the thoughts that Michael has shared as well. So this action agenda is really resulting from a very collaborative effort from around 30 members across the agriculture and food value chain. And we really wanted to look at how to accelerate Scope 3 action in the sector. A quick note on terminology, fully aligned with the points that Pauline and Michael had shared around the need for alignment here. We know that insetting can be taken to mean many different things. So you'll see in our materials, we've actually referred more to in-value chain interventions to be very specific that we're talking about programs within the value chain that can count towards Scope 3. So in the next slide, a little bit of context around the unique nature of agricultural value chains, which really leads to quite specific opportunities and considerations when thinking about Scope 3. So the agricultural value chain that we typically think of at the top here, where we have input provider providing inputs to the farm, we have the farmer or the producer, which is really at the heart of the value chain where the food is raised or grown, and then various steps of kind of trading, aggregating, processing to get to food manufacture and then retail. So within that value chain, what's happening on the farm is really where we see the majority of emissions and also the greatest potential for removals. So all of these actors have really a shared interest about the way our food is grown. But we know that in reality, the value chain is not this neat linear line. You can see the bottom left here. One farm might produce multiple crops. Each crop might be processed into different commodities and so on. So what this means is that often downstream actors don't have full traceability back to a specific farm. And also allocating emissions and removals from land-based processes, so carbon which is released or sequestered from soil or biomass, down to a specific crop, commodity or supply chain is also very difficult, as you can see from the graphic on the right here. So what does this mean for Scope 3 in this sector? Well, we know that Scope 3 practices have to therefore be quite location and context specific. And at the same time, we know that collaboration is key. So if we try and tackle this in silos, we really won't reach the scale that we need. So let me then share on the next slide. I just wanted to share 3 of the main needs which we identified through this work around accelerating agri-food Scope 3 action. The main cross-cutting theme here, I guess, is that accountability can really drive action. So improving measurement and disclosure of Scope 3 emissions is really key to accelerate action and to influence effective practices, which of course need to be location and context specific. So our first theme here is around standards, so the need for clear and usable guidelines for land-based emissions. We know that there's much work happening in this space, such as from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which will resolve some of those open accounting questions. And beyond this, there's also need for more clarity from standards around the strategic role of in-value chain and beyond value chain or landscape-based approaches, for example. The second theme here is around data and accounting. So to put those standards into action, we heard that we really need pragmatic data and accounting approaches for reductions and removals. So that's really about having the quality of data needed to measure the impact of interventions so that we can scale interventions where they're working. So that leads to all sorts of questions around how we can acquire primary data as well as the quality of secondary data in a consistent and credible way from farmers, in a way which also does not burden producers who are collecting that data. And the third theme here is around on-farm incentives. So this is the real need for clear models for collective value chain investment. So that's around trying to create stability in the investments to allow farmers the opportunity to plan and activate those transitions. So that's a brief overview. I'll put a link in the chat to the action agenda if you'd like to see more information on these themes. But I guess we know that there's no quick fix to some of these challenges. But we within WBCSD are aiming to foster collaboration around these themes across the value chain. And we do believe that we can work towards pragmatic solutions to help companies drive action now, because we know we don't have time to wait. So with that, on the next slide, we have put together, together with the IPI team, some shared themes in the findings from WBCSD's report and the IPI report. I'll just share some here, and I'm sure that the panel will pick up on some of these. The first one, which we've touched on, is the need for strengthening the definition of insetting. So to differentiate between different types of interventions, which includes, as we've mentioned, the role of beyond value chain, in value chain, landscape level action, all of which are critical for food system transformation, but play slightly different roles. The second recommendation or need we've heard is around the need for clear guidance for Scope 3, which is robust, but at the same time accommodates the diversity of the agri-food supply chain so that it can be adopted by businesses. The third recommendation set is focused on some of the industry collaboration, which WBCSD is also trying to foster around facilitating that shared investment into value chain programs and supporting sector alignment on some of the enablers around data or MRV tools, for example. And then the fourth and final recommendation, which we heard particularly from a corporate focus, is around the role of business working internally to align sustainability and sourcing teams to really put these Scope 3 or insetting programs as part of the business strategy. And the key message we had there, or the key driver we heard there, was around supply chain resilience being critical for the future of business as well as the future of the food system as a whole. So I hope that's shared some food for thought, and I'll pass back to Pauline to then kick into the panel.
Thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate it. Before we go to the panel, I wanted to do another poll. So here we've tried to summarize the key areas of recommendation that Kate just walked through. And we'd love to hear from the audience what, in your opinion, a lot of you have experience in insetting or know about it. What is it, which recommendation area do you consider to be the most critical for this practice to grow? So no wrong, but we'd love to hear your thoughts and understand what you see as most important. And thank you everyone for participating in the Q&A. We're getting some great questions. We're seeing some voting, so it makes it really easy to know which questions to prioritize. Okay, so we're hearing the first one. Standard setters design clear corporate guidance for Scope 3, but also facilitating increased opportunities to co-invest in insetting projects. Okay, we'll leave it a few more seconds. Thank you everyone for participating. Great. So we have a front runner and one following just behind. See a few more people still contributing. Let's give it a few more seconds. Fantastic. Thank you everyone so much for participating. So we have a clear leader on standard setters, asking them to design clear corporate guidance for Scope 3 and how these projects can play a role, and also industry collaboration and how companies can co-invest in a sort of pre-competitive stage. Great. Just before, this is the Q&A. This is just to remind you, I'm going to now turn to the panel. I have a couple of questions for them, but then we're going to go to the questions that are here. So please do ask your questions and vote. That will help us prioritize the questions. Fantastic. Great. Going to our panel now. And Tzutzuy, thank you so much for being here again. So you're the voice of the corporates today, and I wanted to ask you, how is it that you're integrating insetting and Scope 3 reduction in your broader business operation and in your sustainability strategy? It would just be great to hear how you're approaching it.
Thank you so much, Pauline, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel, and definitely a lot of pressure on my shoulders, right, representing the corporate world in agriculture. So this is really a great honor for me. Yeah, definitely. Let me just share some thoughts about how we are looking at insetting, right? And I think going back to some of the key messages that Kate was sharing, we do see insetting into the context of a mechanism to basically reduce the Scope 3 emissions. So I think this is very, very important, of course, when it comes to how to decarbonize the agri-food value chain, and where insetting is going to be playing an important role there. So it's getting a very interesting mechanism for corporations to look at this more in a strategic way and how to collaborate across the value chain. So because Insetting is going to be bringing a completely different layer of how we are going to be sharing value in the food industry, and also how we are going to be driving collaborations. So from the perspective of Syngenta, we are actually looking at Insetting from different type of perspectives. One of these perspectives is, of course, when it comes to our own operations and how Insetting can help us to reduce Scope 3 emissions of our own agricultural activities. And here we already have some, kind of projects, right? So initiatives in some parts of the world where we are trying actually to support growers to reduce emissions in operations, and by those means, reducing our own Scope 3 emissions. So that's on one side and very closely connected to our businesses, of course, own operations. But when it comes to the other side, which is basically supporting, our customers, it's also Insetting going to be playing a very important role. So basically, with our innovation power, we can support Insetting programs from customers to reduce their own Scope 3 emissions. And coming back to Kate and the report, from WBCSD, so very interestingly here to mention, right? So Scope 3 emissions reductions, very particularly category 1, are going to be super relevant for value chain players down the value chain, right? Because those emissions are basically roughly from 70 to 80% of all the emissions from value chain players. So by helping, the supply shed of those players in reducing their emissions, basically we help them to reduce category 1, we help them to reduce very strongly emissions. So here we believe innovation is going to be playing an important role. Coming back to the question of a strategy and business operations. So it's again, by understanding what are the needs of our customers, we can fit this into our innovation power, and we can bring new solutions to the market to support, programs like Insetting and then supporting growers on the journey to reduce their own emissions. So more than happy, to highlight a little bit more about that and give some more concrete examples on that. Back to you, Pauline.
Thank you. So actually, I do have a follow-up question. I think we've been talking about Insetting in a quite broad way. Would you mind giving a couple of examples of programs that you're working on and what those look like, just to give it a bit more, get more into the practicalities of things?
Yeah, definitely. For instance, we have some programs with some value chain players in China where we are currently helping them to deliver low carbon commodities. By delivering the low carbon commodities, so we are currently working with farmers in the fields, bringing the innovation that they need to actually reduce the carbon footprint of their crops. And by connecting with the value chain players, so they are basically investing in this, in the interventions that the farmers are implementing on the field in order to be able to deliver the low carbon commodity. And by delivering a low carbon commodity, of course, you immediately can reduce the Scope 3 emissions category 1 if you are a value chain player, that is sourcing the products from the farmers. So that's one of the examples. Another example, of course, with our modern agricultural platforms, also we have end-to-end solutions where we are very closely working with farmers, and we are helping and also with innovation to reduce their own emissions and then being able to deliver, low intensity commodities in a broader spectrum for sure. And of course, also having additional, agricultural activities for our own operations where we are also supporting farmers, and we are going to be providing them some incentives for that too. So hopefully that could answer your question, Pauline.
Amazing. No, thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Andrew. Andrew, you're the voice of the developer in this webinar. Traceability, measurements were really identified as some of the key challenges to Insetting practices. How is it that at Soil Capital you're addressing these issues when you're working with corporates? So traceability and measurement.
Sure. Thanks, Pauline, and thanks to Abatable and IPI for the report and today's webinar. Really important contributions. Also, Kate for WBCSD's report as well. So, by background, Soil Capital is an agronomy firm with boots on the ground experience supporting farmers to transition. But nowadays, we run a large-scale regenerative agriculture transition program that brings both the financial incentives and the knowledge at a much larger scale to, as you said in your intro, over 1,000 farmers. And we're using greenhouse gases and carbon as a leading indicator of soil health improvements. which ultimately deliver verified Scope 3 improvements to the food and beverage value chain. So how we quantify that, one of your questions, Pauline, we combine 3 different calculation techniques, approaches: direct measurement, so soil analysis, modeling using a couple of different models, and remote sensing for the verification of some farming practices which are harder to audit through paper trails. And I think it's important to emphasize that we're doing this with primary data from the farm, from the field. In fact, we're collecting in excess of 500 data points per farm per year to fuel these calculations. And we see that that primary data is becoming more and more valuable in the context of companies, thus far having to rely on secondary data, which may not be so accurate. And of course, we've invested really hard money and time and sweat in making that data collection process with farmers smooth, easy, fun, insightful. So it takes a maximum of 3 hours per year now that we're 3 or 4 years into that process. And we're collecting data at field and crop level and then aggregating that up across whole rotations. Your traceability question, we're then not making up our own definition of traceability. We're looking to those existing entities, fora, that are setting standards out there. And on traceability, we use the Value Change Initiative's approach to supply sheds to connect the farmers that we're working with the food and beverage companies that then ultimately invest in their improvements. And that does seem to be working. As you said, we're now working with more than 1,000 farmers. Our farmer numbers have doubled each year we've been in operation. We've verified 200,000 tons of emission reductions and removals. And more importantly, we've moved more than 4 million euros into farmers' pockets to reward them for those results. And there's much more in forward-looking contracted value as well. But what I would say, maybe to close, is that there are, of course, still problems here. And I think, Kate, you referred quite nicely to a few of them. We see that farmers, of course, have to invest and work across whole rotations. Companies are often buying a single crop. So there's a mismatch there that inhibits the scale up of insetting investment. There's another dimension to that, which is that farmers are producing wheat, for example, but companies may well be buying derivative products, wheat gluten, which only represents a fraction of that original ton of wheat, which is where the removals and reductions have happened. So there's a potential mismatch there, which can inhibit more investment. And I'm actually really pleased to say that by the end of this month, SustainCert will have published a white paper bringing forward credible technical solutions, accounting solutions that help with exactly those two problems. And I think it's exactly those kinds of pragmatic accounting solutions that both of your reports are calling for.
Thank you so much, Andrew. You mentioned supply sheds. Would you mind just quickly explaining what that means? I think not everyone on the webinar may know.
Yeah, not to take up too much time, but it takes as its starting point the problem with using the terminology supply chain, which assumes perfect traceability from farmer to processor, trader, and manufacturer and retailer, which in a commodity context is simply not what we have. And so a supply shed, it's been an evolving definition, but you effectively take the first point of collection at a subnational or national, if you don't have it, a geographic level. And if you can connect the buyer on the value chain with that first point of connection at a national or subnational level with your farmer, then it's a credible enough link in the context of commodity value chains to say that that farmer is within the supply shed of that value chain and therefore within the scope 3. There's much more nuance and detail in the value change initiative work, but that's a 1-minute summary.
Thank you so much. I'm asking because I'm seeing a lot of questions on this topic as well. Elijah, I'm going to turn to you, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. Conservation International. You have a broader scope than insetting and value chain. So I wanted to ask, what do you see insetting projects and investment in this area? What's the role beyond carbon? Does it play a role? And can you tell us about how at CI you're approaching insetting, and does it play a role in landscape approaches, which I know Conservation International is an advocate of?
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again. Thanks for the great intro and for the work that's been mentioned so far. So I guess just getting some context to start with. For those of you who don't know, Conservation International, we're a global environmental NGO, about 1,600 people across 30 country programs that are mostly located in the global south. So some of these issues are a little different in different contexts. Obviously, each supply chain is different, and then in each region also there's different challenges with levels of capacity. And then we also have projects across close to 100 countries outside of those country programs. And we're very focused on nature for people as a way to simplify it, right? So we're doing work in oceans and productive environments, in pristine forests, working with indigenous peoples. But the point is that we're always, for any place where we're supporting protection, management, and restoration of nature, we want to make sure that it serves the needs of the people that are protecting it and relying on it, and put them in the driver's seat, ideally, of designing it. So that's hopefully gives you some sense of the kind of the NGO perspective that I'm coming with. And you mentioned part of my role is leading our approach on insetting. So quickly to answer that question, it has two key pillars. One is focused on what we can do within our own portfolio of projects. So they'll connect the work that we're doing in productive landscapes that might be in coffee or cocoa or palm oil or soy, just as examples. There's many more than that. Trying to connect that work that we're doing to insetting as a potentially growing, scalable funding mechanism. And then the second pillar is what can we do outside of our own portfolio? So how can we advocate for the scaling of high quality insetting action in the broader ecosystem, which obviously we are a small part of. For both of these efforts, both what we do in our own action, in our own projects and beyond our own projects, we want to ensure that insetting investments are prioritized and designed considering the non-carbon benefits that insetting can support in the broader landscape as well. Because insetting done right has the potential to support ecosystem services, supply chain resilience, and community well-being, in addition, of course, to the greenhouse gas reductions or removals that are often more quickly monetized. But with the challenges is that with carbon goggles on, while in some cases and in some contexts, carbon can be an awesome, quickly quantifiable indicator, as Andrew mentioned. We also want to make sure that we're not just prioritizing investments with carbon as the only thing in mind, and failing to recognize the benefits to ecosystems and communities that frankly are going to be critical for long-term success of any of these programs. So as we know, every farm operates in a broader system, right? A landscape. And that landscape has many types of resource users that each have different needs and aspirations, that all rely on healthy, resilient ecosystems for basic necessary inputs like ecosystem services to support the long-term health and security of the people that are there, and obviously the ecosystems as well. And if we fail to consider these landscape aspects, there's a major risk that these insetting investments may go south, essentially may not be sustainable in the long term. For example, we can build the greenest low carbon supply chain in the world, but it won't matter if the forests upland from the farm are cut down, threatening the water supply and or increasing the risk of floods and landslides for the producers. Or another example, if there are no schools, hospitals, or other basic services, people will move to cities and you'll have no farmers, no workers, and ultimately no sustainable supply of goods. So you have to consider the social factor, of course. And then finally, while governance structures are critical for this to ensure credibility, essentially, they won't succeed if the people that are ultimately on the ground doing the work can't earn a living, if those benefits are not shared. So there's just a few examples as to why insetting interventions have to take into account all the needs and uses within a specific landscape, and to understand exactly what that landscape can support and how decisions in one part affect the livelihoods, benefits, or investments, business operations in another part. And that sounds like, I guess the first reaction of a lot of people to that is, oh, that's a huge amount of stuff. We're not gonna be able to do that. Thanks, bye. But the good news is that there's a growing, a lot of work towards what are called landscape initiatives that's already happening. There's already a whole bunch of these that have already been developed that are trying to characterize. Although the landscape initiatives look different in each place, there's a growing set of tools and a clear approach for developing them, and a number of organizations are supporting their creation. So it's going to become easier and easier for companies to tap into these things and then figure out how their insetting work should, their work that they're investing in to achieve their scope 3 targets can kind of tie into those programs. And actually, companies are going to have to do this increasingly. So we're talking about this all in the context of carbon, largely because of science-based targets and because of the regulation that's required companies to treat carbon very seriously. But we're not so far from the same level of rigor being required for nature strategies. And already science-based targets for nature framework requires that companies engage in at least one key landscape initiative in their supply chain. So considering these connections is kind of a way of future-proofing investments as well. Hopefully that wasn't too much.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn to the Q&A. And if you haven't already, you can vote for the questions. So if this question you really want to see, make sure you vote. And Elijah, I think I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you know about this stuff. This is the question that's been most voted on. How are insetting activities accounted for under the GHG protocol? Could you provide an example? So I'm putting Elijah on the spot, but if anyone wants to jump in, please do.
Yeah, and I'm sure others will have very good experience on this in slightly different contexts. Yeah, so big picture, right? I mean, the reason we're still using the insetting term, just to first of all clarify something here, is the greenhouse gas protocol has limitations, right? The things that are going to be countable in any kind of, it's a hard challenge they're trying to line they're trying to walk, where you have to have every emission be accountable to some organization, or more the other way around. Actually, every organization has to figure out what exactly is accountable to them, which may exclude some of those things that are beyond the farm gates, for example. So some things that organizations are calling insetting, the reason we're still using the term insetting is because it's a little bit broader than just scope 3 interventions. But we recognize, of course, that most money is going to go to scope 3 interventions. Directly answering the question, good examples of this, for example, in a coffee, I'll give a coffee example and then I'll let others provide maybe more other context examples, but would be transitioning a coffee system from a full sun ecosystem to a growing system to an agroforestry system, or reducing fertilizer inputs by increasing use of organic compost on farm. Those are examples of things that would cause either reductions and or removals that right now today are not countable according to the greenhouse gas protocol, but will be once the land use and removals guidance is finalized. And I'm sure Andrew and Tzutzuy have much more to say about that.
I think Kate wanted to jump in on this one.
Oh,
well, I think Elijah summarized what I was going to say anyway, Pauline, but yes, I would echo that. So it can be, big picture, insetting can be a mechanism for scope 3 reductions and removals. In practice, as Elijah referenced, there's some kind of emerging discussions around what that looks like and some of the boundaries, and can we refer to supply shed, which Andrew had referred to. But in principle, it can be linked with scope 3. But I would echo the point that insetting also has wider benefits beyond what might be claimable under a scope 3 inventory. So wider benefits, not just for climate, but also for nature and farmer livelihoods.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to jump to the next question. We are getting a lot of questions. I maybe shouldn't have incentivized so many times. No, I'm kidding. Hopefully we can take some of these away and answer them offline as well. So the second most voted question was, how can insetting and offsetting projects be applied on the same field, respecting the best standards? Example, sustain certain vera, while avoiding double claiming. Does anyone want to take this question?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at that, Pauline. Speaking from practical experience with soil capital, our strategic focus is scope 3, verified scope 3 reductions. So within the value chain, we have a lot of relationships with food and beverage companies. We've never really engaged in any offsetting activities, but we do work with companies outside of the value chain that wish to make a claim of contribution to global net zero. So I think this question applies. We have to solve this challenge in practice, and I think there's two elements to it. As the questioner has written, one is that there can be different standards that apply, and the second is how you then in practice do that for a given field to manage the double claiming risk. so on the first one, the basic answer is that you have to have a protocol, a set of rules in place as a project developer in our position that are validated against both relevant standards. In our case, we've been using one of the ISO standards for a long time, which works well for both contribution claims and Scope 3 claims, sharing a lot of sort of in principle foundations with greenhouse gas protocol. And then, the double claiming issue is I think solved by good and transparent inventory management. So that only one field in our program at any one time one field can only generate a certain number of reductions and removals, and there is a transparent, consistent log of whether those have been sold to one party, either within the value chain or outside the value chain. A lot of those systems are working off trust at the moment. I think bringing greater transparency into those kinds of inventory management systems is part of what's going to be needed over the next several years.
Thank you, Andrew. I see 2 hand raised. Elijah, do you want to go first?
Very briefly, I don't want to take too much space, but yeah, I think there's the really interesting piece that I think a lot about is how can these two systems positively interact with each other. Like, for example, for the rotating crop situation, right, where maybe one of the 3 crop rotations has a buyer, how can we use the offset market to like bring more capital into these transitions? But also that's further from my world. The closer to my world is we would do a lot of reduced emissions from deforestation projects, RED projects, and it's super interesting to think about how can we effectively setting as another piece in the capital stack, essentially, for nesting these projects alongside value chain projects alongside avoided deforestation projects, for example. I'm really excited to see, and eventually biodiversity credits, same deal. How can we effectively use these tools together? Not an answer quite yet, but really exciting area.
Thank you. Tzutzuy.
Yeah, sure. So I would like just to share, some comments on the offsetting, insetting elements. I think it's going to be super important, to have the transparency and also not to forget why we're doing this. And we are doing this because we want to generate positive impact, right? So I think in that context, like if we generate 1 carbon saving, so it needs to be, this 1 carbon saving accounted to, 1 company or 1 corporation, but we cannot account for the same saving for different type of corporations unless you are within the same value chain and you have put efforts for generating that saving. In that context, I think, like the current discussions that are currently happening, at the value chain initiative is exactly how to share the value within your value chain. In that, like having offsetting and insetting for the same type of program or the same type of project, it will be very challenging. And I think we shouldn't forget why we are doing this. We are not doing this just for the sake of having inventories in our corporations and reducing our emissions, but we are doing this to reduce emissions, to try to contain climate change. And this is very, very important. The more we are actually driving this agenda, the more corporations are actually helping to reduce the Scope 3 emissions, the better it's going to be for this planet. So we shouldn't forget that. It is not only about a market mechanism, it's about the future and really sustaining our future as humanity, for a really long time here. So just sharing that and having some, like going back to the why we are doing this.
Thank you very much. We have a question on the value for the producer in an insetting strategy. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what producer refers to here, but it would be great to get some thoughts, maybe, on the farmer side, but also on the company investing. And then I think we'll have covered the question. So anyone wants to take this one?
I'm happy to have a go, maybe being quite
Please.
close to the, well, if we assume that the meaning of the question is what's the value of the farmer as a producer in an, I'll interpret it like that. I think it was Tzutzuy who said earlier that 70 to 80% of the global emissions of a food and beverage company are likely to be at farm level. So however we define insetting, the value of the farmer is that you can't tackle that problem without them. So I think that's one way to answer the question. Sort of, it's an integral role. I think there's maybe another level to answer it though, which is to place an emphasis on financial value, maybe. I think we are in a context where in at least many industrialized farming systems, farmers are earning a smaller and smaller proportion of the combined value creation in that value chain, and yet they're asked to take an awful lot of the risk. And when we talk to them about changing their farming practices, the narrative, the reality of that for a typical farmer is that that's a risk consideration, changing your fundamental operating system. So when I read that question, I'm triggered to say, look, what we all need to do is to find ways to increase the value we ascribe to farmers in food and beverage value chains, to recognize appropriately the risks they take and the ecosystem services that they are capable of increasing. They already do a lot today, but that they're capable of increasing if they farm to improve soil health, for example.
Thank you, Andrew. So you have your hand raised.
Sure. Just complimenting on that, definitely, you know, like most of the heavy lift is going to be at the farm level. So it's going to be basically the farmers catalyzing this transition, right? So when it comes to category 1 of purchase goods of services, right, from the food value chain players, it's going to be at the farm level. What does that mean? Of course, investment needs to be done. So the farmers need to get a return of investment. Normally in the offsetting market, when you generate your carbon credits and then other companies are buying those carbon credits, you know, the prices are very volatile. We can currently see prices in the market from $3 to $45, you know, and these going back to the farmer. In the insetting programs, they are closed business transactions. So they are basically investment that is being done, you know, with the farmers, in collaboration with farmers and also players in the value chain. So the answer is yes. Investment needs to go back to the farmer. The farmer needs to be supported in the journey to actually reduce their own emissions, and by those means supporting the other actors of the value chain.
Thank you both. A slight change of topic. Question, do the panelists feel that the changing European legislation around green labeling will drive corporates to do more insetting? So I think this probably refers to recent news that the EU is moving towards regulating claims like carbon neutrality. Andrew, take it away.
I mean, I think plenty of the people on this call, not just the panelists, would have better positions, you know, sitting in companies. But I mean, the blunt reality is that this question is, I think, referring to the Green Claims Directive, which is effectively said if you want to communicate that a product is carbon neutral, you're no longer allowed to rely on offsets to do that. You have to fundamentally reduce the inherent footprint, scope 1, 2, 3 of that product. So I don't think it's a particularly controversial answer, actually, because I think that's just a basic summary of the law that's just been passed in Europe. It becomes a mandatory requirement if companies still want to communicate about the environmental performance of their products, which I think, you know, despite the challenges there and the social pushback on greenwashing claims and lawsuits and so on, I can't see it going away over the next 5-10 years for companies to want to be able to communicate about the environmental impacts of their products.
Anyone want to mention anything on this one? Nope. Great.
Just to confirm, so Andrew, you're saying yes, right? That's like the conclusion is that yes, it will.
Yes.
Okay, good. Agree.
Thank you. I have a question getting a little bit more technical. How long should an insetting project be? How can we define permanence for insetting projects and manage it? Who would like to take this one? Go ahead, Elijah. I see you're ready. No.
Yeah, no, I can jump. I'm sure others will have meaningful things to add here. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be defined. Well, so first of all, obviously, the greenhouse gas protocol is realistically going to be the de facto guide on this. I know the typical way this is being approached, as far as I'm aware, in most contexts, is similar to pulling from the voluntary carbon market. How would you develop a carbon crediting project, usually with a 20 to 30 year time frame, and then with some mechanism, obviously, to manage cases where there are reversals. I think that answers the question. And that gets to two just very quick points. the social side of this, right? Like if we're talking about a 30-year project, it's super important we figure out how that the folks that are actually doing the work on the ground are fairly compensated and get some of the value for that, because the market is going to be totally different in 20 years, and the value of that on the voluntary carbon market, for example, might be very different. And so that's why I think it's so important to consider these larger landscape factors.
Thank you very much.
Maybe just to add on that, I think there are some standards being developed around the topic of insetting for sure, right? So beyond the greenhouse gas protocol, and so those standards are being trying to cope with the greenhouse gas protocol and to be matched there. And so just, you know, like there are some recommendations already developing. The market's still moving. A lot of things are still, you know, like different moving pieces, but it would be definitely super, super important to get very clear, you know, like the guidance of, you know, how the removals should be there, for how long, the permanence and all these things, especially for agriculture, you know, to basically avoid any kind of greenwashing activity. So that's going to be super important to have clarity on the rules. And I think this goes back to the comments that Kate was mentioning, you know, from the report. So I think these are a couple of the challenges we will need to be resolved in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. I'm going to close the questions for now because we have a couple of call to actions, but I wanted to say huge thank you to the panelists. We'll have a look at the questions and see if we can answer some of them offline. But just quickly, 2 call to actions off the back of this webinar. WBCSD is doing a lot of amazing work, working across working with companies, but also other organizations like Conservation International, like the IPI. So if you'd like to learn more about the work, if you'd like to be involved in the Scope 3 land-based emissions, please reach out to Kate. These slides will be shared, so you will have access to the email. And also, please do read our reports. They are great if you want to learn more about this. And also a couple more things on the IPI and Conservation International. There's going to be a stakeholder consultation led by Conservation International to clarify principle definitions, kicking off in March. Elijah will be the point of contact for that. Join the Insetting Academy if you want to learn more about the practices, about the details, and get quite technical on this. The IPI is also looking for some case studies. And finally, also consider becoming a member of the IPI if you want to have access to a community of people who are developing projects, want to learn more. So those would be the call to actions. But just to close the webinar, again, huge thank you for everyone for joining, to the panelists. I really liked what Tzutzuy said about reminding ourselves why we're here, leading with trust and transparency. We don't have all the rules figured out. We don't even have the definitions figured out, but we know that insetting is the way forward. We just need to, you know, make sure that we build this market with trust and confidence. And yeah, I'm very excited for the year to come and see how things develop. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Bye now.